The White House that President Trump has constructed has a lot of chiefs.
If she had become president, the world would still be this complicated.
This will probably get me in a lot of trouble, but I do think there is a degree of admiration for a strong man. I'm sorry.
I've never seen anything like this. People just flat out lie.
Welcome to the Global Politico. I'm Susan Glasser, and each week I'll be taking you backstage in a world disrupted. Join us every Monday morning for new episodes. Rate and subscribe to us on iTunes or whatever your preferred podcast platform is. And do email me anytime at sglasser@politico.com. And now, this week's show. Well, hi, I'm Susan Glasser, and welcome back to the Global Politico. I'm delighted to have Congressman Adam Kinzinger once again as our guest this week. And you know, really, it's a great opportunity. I've wanted to have him as the Global Politico almost since I launched this podcast now 5 months ago, more or less, which is exactly
Congrats,
how long,
by the way.
Yeah, which is exactly the length of the Trump presidency. And the reason I always wanted to have you, Congressman, as a guest is I've often thought back to a conversation that we had last summer, so just about a year ago now, at the Republican National Convention in Cleveland. And at the time, perhaps it was a little bit of an academic discussion over what kind of a foreign policy president Donald Trump might be. But I'll set the stage for you a little bit. Just that morning, the New York Times had an interview with Donald Trump, and I believe you were already a little bit not sure that you really could support your party's nominee. He would then take the stage the next day and make his acceptance speech, a very kind of dark vision of America that echoed his future inaugural American Carnage speech. But at that point, that hadn't happened. But the New York Times had this fascinating interview with Donald Trump in which he raised all sorts of questions about American foreign policy. And I was amazed to have you come in there and sit down and just sort of start saying exactly what you thought. And your analysis holds up pretty strongly a year later. And so I thought we'd start with a quote from that event of a year ago. You said,
I think part of it, though, is Donald Trump believes in strongmen. Vladimir Putin's a strongman. I mean, he's tough. He says tough things. He rides a horse with his shirt off, for goodness sakes. And he's a tough guy. And I think that attracts Donald Trump to him. The foreign policy, I call it a narcissistic foreign policy coming from Donald Trump. And it's the idea that, you know, the world needs us. If we're going to be in Korea or we're going to have troops in Germany, they need to pay us for this. I'm offended by the idea that I'm some kind of a protection racket that has to be paid to protect our allies, or I'm some kind of a mercenary force.
Okay, a year later, a narcissistic foreign policy. In a way, that might be the best description I've seen yet. People are always trying to impose doctrines on Donald Trump. Do you still think narcissistic foreign policy fits?
You know, I think it's very interesting to me to look at where we are versus where the rhetoric of a year ago. I've actually been very pleased with what I've seen out of this presidency, the bombing of the airfield in Syria, holding to the red line, pushing back against red line crossings in Syria. I think, you know, by actions pushing back against Russia, not necessarily words. So I've been impressed with that. At the same time, you have the actions compared to the words. And the words have still been, you know, you go to NATO, and I think there has to be an understanding, yes, NATO needs to pay more money. It needs to meet its commitment to national defense. But the reality is, NATO, we're not doing NATO a favor. NATO, as much as anything, is doing us a favor. We're helping each other. That's what mutual defense is about. And so I think I would like to see more words about the fact that, you know, our involvement in the world is not just out of the charity of heart, it's out of necessity. We're not in South Korea just because we love the South Koreans. There's a strategic interest to us there. The South Koreans already pay for half of our troops that are stationed there. It's actually cheaper to have a troop in South Korea than it is like in Alabama because of that. And so I think to an extent the words have been still somewhat of a narcissistic view of why America exists in the world, but the actions of the administration I've actually been pretty happy with.
Well, you're capturing sort of, I think, what we've all observed, right, is that there's Donald Trump and his Twitter feed and his personal instincts and views about foreign policy. And now, of course, he has an entire administration, or maybe not a fully staffed one. We can talk about that later. Right. But he has an administration. He's hired a Secretary of Defense who's widely respected. He's hired a National Security Advisor, a Secretary of State. And so trying and struggling, I think we all are, to figure out what's the balance between the people he's put into power, the existing policies that their departments represent, and then the role that the president himself plays. We had a pretty stark demonstration of that over the last couple of weeks when we had Trump once again seeming to make foreign policy by tweet on North Korea and China, for example. We are very confused. What is our policy in the Middle East? So how do you look at that? You're up here on Capitol Hill, obviously, so you're not sitting in the room, but you're debating this with your colleagues on the Foreign Affairs Committee. How do you look at the difference between the president himself and, this whole foreign policy and national security infrastructure that we have?
Well, I've never been in the White House in terms of in power or been in the administration, so it's hard for me to say, the president definitely has final say in terms of anything on foreign policy, but there's also a structure that acts beyond him. There are decisions that are made. For instance, shooting down an Su-22 in Syria was probably not something that the president directly gave the order to, but he did give the leverage to his commanders to make that decision. So it's kind of hard to tell where that falls. There's also the issue of, look, President Trump is a good entertainer, and frankly, he knows how to communicate with people he needs to communicate to. And he understands that this kind of idea of American first is really attractive to people, so he says it. This NATO needs us, we're doing them a favor, that idea. But what I've seen in action is he seems to be giving a pretty significant amount of leverage to his team around him, which is what we want to see. For instance, as we learn about what the future of Afghanistan is going to be and the amount of troops and everything else, he seems to be empowering General Mattis and or Secretary Mattis and others to make that decision, and that's a good thing. So it's a dichotomy I don't think I can figure out in terms of the difference between the words of the president and the actions, but I'll tell you, I've been happy with the actions, the words, not so much.
Mm-hmm. So, last year in our conversation at the RNC, you said the president is a dictator on foreign policy, and that was part of the reason you had so many concerns, recognizing there were few constraints on his action. And of course, the question of what role Congress can play is one that a lot of people have been asking. How does it look now that you're trying to think about what are the constraints you would want to put around a president in the Oval Office on foreign policy? You guys are considering a Russia sanctions bill right now. Tell me a little bit about the balance between executive and legislative power in the Trump era.
So I believe in, when it comes to foreign policy, in a very strong executive branch. As somebody that's existed, and I'm probably a minority view in Congress in this. Everybody wants to have their say. The problem is, between House and the Senate, there's 535 of us. And all of us out here think that we could be a good commander-in-chief. And so you have 535 members of Congress that all have their idea of how to fight ISIS, how to push back against Syria, et cetera. And the problem is, in this complicated world where it's not about, in the 1700s when you declare war against England, it takes 3 months to even get the message there. This is all real-time things. We find out there's a chemical attack or there's a fighter bombing our allies, that kind of stuff. This has to be leverage given to the president. So I would vote for and like to see us pass a use of force authorization against ISIS. I don't think the president needs it, but I think we should. The problem is you have members of Congress out here that want to put constraints in it, a time limit, a troop limit, a this and this. You cannot, as members of Congress, tie the hands of the president. You give him a goal, which is destroy ISIS, and you let him decide how to get there. And so, and then on things of Russia, for instance, I do think Congress can play a strong role in sending a message to the administration and to Russia that Congress believes that sanctions at this point are the best thing to deal with what's been going on. So I do think there's a role for Congress to play, but I give a lot of military leverage to the president because I just don't. I know my colleagues out here, I love them all, but a lot of them don't know anything about the military or warfare. They think they do.
Well, and we should note, of course, that you served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think that's part of what gives you a different perspective in general on foreign policy. You've rated it as a much more important reason why you're in Congress in the first place than most of your colleagues. But let's drill in a little bit on that Russia sanctions bill, because it's an interesting case study, right? It's one of the first examples that's come up where you have clearly a policy disagreement by, I would say, the majority of Republicans on Capitol Hill are eager to show that they're still in favor of a tougher approach to Vladimir Putin and to Russia than President Trump has personally at least indicated. You have this bill coming over from the Senate, and there's a sense, though, that here on the House side is where Trump's allies may try to water it down or change it. What are the dynamics inside the Republican conference here?
I haven't sensed the dynamics within the conference yet. I think this is so new, and we just assumed this was going to happen. It's so new. What we're hearing today, as of the day we're talking, is that there's a blue slip issue. Fine, maybe that's the case. Revenue originating from the House versus the Senate. That needs to be fixed. But I think if there is an attempt to water this down, there will be some holy hell from some of us that would be very upset about this. Look, you have interests. I don't want to name names, but it's the same kind of special interests that opposed Russian sanctions in the past that I specifically talked to and said, don't you dare come in here because of that. And they're trying to do it again, and they're scaring members. You have European nations that are trying to meet with all of us that are saying, specifically Germany. Germany's saying they're worried about this pipeline issue. Well, look, Germany shut down all of their nuclear plants, so they became reliant on natural gas. So don't come into me with a sad story. I love Germany. My family originated from Germany. But don't come in here because you guys screwed up your power grid and say that you're basically inept to respond to the Russians. So let's see how this blue slip issue goes about, but I think you will see a House that is very, very eager to make sure this thing passes.
That's so interesting about Germany. So basically, they're worried that in almost an overreaction to Trump and the fear of him being too accommodating to the Russians, they're worried that Congress would go in the other direction, in effect, and potentially make things worse with the Russians and compromise their ability, as they see it, to negotiate with their big neighbor.
Basically. And but you have to be tough. And I understand that they have an interest and a concern. You have to protect your own people. Germany's a very successful country. But again, they shut down all of their nuclear plants in an overreaction to some things. And so there's some price to pay for it. Now, we should continue to work with Germany to make sure we're exporting natural gas, to make sure that they have the ability to exploit their natural gas and the allies in the region. But we've got to do everything. The one-trick pony of Russia is their ability to export natural gas. That's their best foreign policy tool because their jets can barely fly. It's that ability to do natural gas. And keep in mind, the economy of Russia is about the size of just a little larger than the economy of Illinois. And we have 50 states. They have one big one.
Well, it's funny. When I was Moscow correspondent at the very beginning of Putin's tenure, he used to talk without irony and saying his goal was to make sure that Russia's economy would grow to be as big as Portugal's, the smallest member of the EU at the time.
That's right.
And I think that's revealing about what they inherited from the Soviet Union well. But so I think your example about this House, the sanctions bill, is really interesting because it suggests all of the competing politics around Russia right now, which has emerged as this major foreign policy issue of the Trump administration. One of the things that I think I and others are struggling to understand is what has gone on with the politics of Russia in the Republican Party as a result of candidate Trump, now President Trump's different rhetoric about Vladimir Putin. You've seen an amazing turnaround in the polls, certainly, which suggests that Republicans who used to be the sort of get tough on Russia party have flip-flopped dramatically in terms of public opinion surveys, and it's now Democrats, by and large, who express much more hawkish views
about
Russia.
I welcome them finally, by the way, to be Russia hawks because they weren't a few years ago.
Well, but that's right. Both parties have shown that they are very flexible, shall we say, in their ideology. What does that mean, though? Here on Capitol Hill, have your Republican colleagues really changed their mind about Vladimir Putin?
I hope not. Some have. I have a few friends that basically express a lot of, they believe this kind of idea, which is so flawed, it's unbelievable, that it's either strongman or terrorism, right? Bashar al-Assad in Syria and Russia's backing him, or it's just chaos and ISIS everywhere. I don't believe that. I mean, I don't think strongmen work anymore anyway because with internet, with the ability to communicate, people don't like to be oppressed. I know we may think they do, but they don't. And so they'll throw off the shackles of dictatorship. So people sometimes see the Russians and they buy into this idea that bombing hospitals, bombing schools, basically beating the crap out of the Muslims, basically somehow will help us win this war on terror. And all it does, frankly, is create more enemies. So I always try to make that clear to people. But in terms of the broader politics of Russia, I was disappointed once when I saw a poll that said Vladimir Putin is more popular among Republicans than Barack Obama. And I say, look, I was no fan of President Obama. I think he's a good man. But I would much rather have him as my president than Vladimir Putin, who kills his political enemies. I'll just say briefly, it shows how much people need leadership on foreign policy.
Well, that's been your consistent theme all along, is that you need to follow and lead and not follow when it comes to foreign policy, which is not necessarily how our political class is generally defined, I would say. But yeah, somebody said to me, I said I was going to interview you today, and they said, well, I feel like he's become sort of the John McCain of the House, when it comes to foreign policy in the Republican Party. That's not always an easy role to play. What is it like to be out there kind of disagreeing where you do on issues of principle with the White House, with the administration? Do you get a lot of pushback here?
You do, but I have a lot of respect for Senator McCain, and I think, through his time as a senator and his controversies he's done, he was the first guy to call for a surge in Iraq. Everybody thought he was crazy for that, and it worked. I have a lot of respect for him. The thing I've learned, so in 2013, I was one of the few House Republicans with Mike Pompeo, frankly, to actually call for giving the president the authority to bomb Syria. The calls in my office at that time were ballistic of people asking me to resign. I'm a warmonger, everything else. History's proven correct that would have been the right thing to do. So for me, look, the job's not particularly fun. And I get elected because I want to make a difference and I want to make an impact. That's what's fun for me, serving the people in my district, making a big impact on the international front. And so, you ask what's it like? It's actually kind of invigorating to sometimes stand up and just say what needs to be said.
Early on, I was envisioning sort of like the internal monologue of John McCain every day, waking up, after January 20th, and sort of like, okay, do I tweet about this one? Like, do I let this one go? What do I pick a fight on, and what do I not? What are your principles for, sort of like, okay, when do I go on TV to say like enough is enough?
Yeah.
Or, which fights do you pick?
It's almost a day-to-day decision. So I like President Trump, and I like a lot of the things he's doing as a Republican. Again, I mentioned foreign policy. The actions in foreign policy are good. The agenda on domestic policy. The area where I will pick a fight or have a disagreement, I think that's a better word to say, is something that's egregious on foreign policy. A tone, political tone. I've tried to make, as well as foreign policy and representing my district, political tone a big issue. I think I yearn for the day that we can get back to disagreeing without threatening people's lives and breaking up Thanksgiving dinner. And so that's another area I'll pick a disagreement on. But it's really a moment by moment choice. I'm not out looking to argue with the president. Like I said, I like him, but on areas where I feel like my responsibility is to America and to my district. It's not to the Republican Party.
What do you see, by the way, as Flashlines other than Russia? That obviously is an area where the center of gravity politically on Russia had been very different than what Trump came in talking about. Are there other areas that you're constantly sort of making that balance? I mean, trade was something that seemed like it would become a much bigger issue. It still might, in terms of Republicans being free traders up here on the Hill and having a president who's talking in much more protectionist terms. I
think trade is a big issue. I mean, I'm a free trader, fair trade, right? But what we've seen is the president basically has said, okay, we're going to kill the Pacific Trade Agreement, which I think was a mistake. But at the same time, we haven't pulled out of NAFTA. I think we're going to be negotiating some one-on-one trade agreements. So I do think he followed through on his promise, but at the same time, it's not quite what people thought he was going to be. I think we have a tendency, I'm actually very supportive of the president on the issue of infrastructure. We have to build this country. And frankly, as a conservative Republican, if you read the Constitution, it outlines the role of the federal government in infrastructure. I get dismayed when I hear some of my colleagues say the federal government shouldn't have a role. But I think that could be a flashpoint with other members that are more budget hawk focused. And the other, I'd say lastly, is just the budget in general can be a flashpoint. We want to increase military spending, but at the same time, to really deal with the debt in this country, it's going to take entitlements. And we all know that. Both sides know that. We just pretend like it's not the case. We have to reform Social Security for a guy my age, 39 years old. You can make changes to it to save it from my parents. But, the president made a promise not to touch it. And so we're going to continue to try to cut the military or cut discretionary spending when we know what the real problem is.
I thought we had left Russia behind, but the truth is we have to go back to it. We've avoided it for how many whole minutes? 19 whole minutes here.
All right.
Okay. The Russia investigation, which is not the same thing as the Russia policy conversation. This is this shadow, right, that's sort of hanging over all of these conversations. After James Comey's testimony, you said that President Trump, without a doubt, acted improperly, although we would wait and see, what the actual investigative conclusion is. I don't know if you saw it, but I was struck today by an op-ed that former Senator Lowell Weicker from Connecticut, Republican from Connecticut, wrote in the New York Times he's the last surviving member of the Watergate Select Committee. And he wrote about basically the duties of members of Congress in this kind of a situation. And I thought it was very interesting because, of course, he's making the argument that was much more bipartisan, that Republicans as well as Democrats, if you go back and listen to the Watergate tapes, which he said he'd been doing recently, that you can't tell really just by listening to the voices which party a member of Congress is in. I suspect that would not be the case if you listened to the Comey questioning and you didn't know whether the senator was a Republican or a Democrat. You could probably guess pretty quickly. What is your responsibility as a member of Congress in an investigation of the president?
Well, it's to be a check on the executive branch. It's to uphold the Constitution, and it's to do the right thing. It's interesting. I think President Trump has brought some of this on himself by just the constant tweeting, right? Talking about tapes, talking about this kind of stuff. And I wish he would do what President Clinton did, which was say, hey, look, the investigation will go on. I have work to do for the American people. That's good for America, Republican Party, and the president if he did that. But at the same time, I've said we deserve answers. I do care about 2018. I care about 2020 as a Republican. But my deepest burden in this whole situation is not about that. It's about the institution of government. Because when people have their faith in this government undermined, right or left or in between, if you believe that we're not getting to the answers or there's doubt that there was collusion with Russia, and I personally don't think the president colluded with Russia, but I think we'll figure that out through this process of this investigation. That's what American people need, is to know that justice has been served, to know we can hold our leaders, especially the president, accountable to concerns. That's what makes us unique. In Iran, you're not going to be able to have a commission to investigate the Ayatollah. It's just not going to work. It's not going to happen in Russia. It's unique about us because that's how this institution, which represents people from all different countries, backgrounds, colors, creeds, ethnicities. That's how we've worked, is we believe we hold our government accountable. And that's frustrating to some of us out here sometimes because, Congress has a 9% approval rating. But it's our favorite pastime to hold our politicians accountable and dislike them. We just need answers. And if there's nothing here and Mueller comes out and says it, this is going to backfire against the left pretty big.
Well, so did you watch the Comey testimony?
Most of it, yeah.
Yeah. What? Just tell me about your reaction. I mean, neither you nor I in our lifetime has ever seen, the director of the FBI go under oath and call the president of the United States a liar.
Right. Well, it's disappointing that he said it or had to say it. I don't like, the world is watching this, and I believe America's job is to be an example of self-governance to a world drowning in chaos, and then when we're drowning in our own chaos, it doesn't really help us with that mission. But at the same time, it was, in watching that, there was no smoking gun to say, the president obstructed justice. As I mentioned, I think he acted improperly. I think probably most people would admit that. But that's very different than saying obstructed justice. I do think truth matters in general.
Just to be clear, you could imagine a situation where the investigation fills out that picture and makes the point that it's obstruction. You're not saying
that it is or it isn't.
Right.
Yep.
You're just saying that the testimony itself did not conclusively prove that to you.
Yep. And I'm not a lawyer, and I don't frankly quite know what that rises to. But on the broader point, which is the issue of truth, I learned in Sunday school growing up that, truth, there is an absolute truth and truth matters. Sometimes people can see truth through a different lens, but there is truth. And where I really worry is that people don't believe in truth anymore. They believe in simply what comports with their worldview. So they go on the website that has all the news stories that basically shows what they believe back at them. Some people go on this news site over here. And it's created this problem where people only believe what they already pre-believed. It's a confirmation bias. That's a scary thing when there's no like truth anymore. And that's another thing that bothers me. It worries me.
I'm sure you get some of that from, your constituents or people out there. What about up here on Capitol Hill? Do you think that people live in information bubbles here as members of Congress?
It's a good question. I think some do, but I also think the men and women I work with on both sides of the aisle are actually really, really impressive people. And I think they can see both sides of arguments. One of the things that I lament that I wish we could do differently is people see us fight, but they never see when the cameras are off where we're actually buddies out here. And that's what I wish we could show more of. But yeah, so there's probably some confirmation bias with people, but I think for the most part, I have a lot of respect for the people I work with, and I think they get good news from great sources.
Mm-hmm. It was a pretty talking point laden response that you saw, the public response to the Comey testimony, right? You had Republicans saying there's no smoking gun. Right. You had Democrats saying this is the gravest accusation, made in a hearing since Watergate. That doesn't really lend, it's not inspiring to people, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, frankly, the Democrats have been way overly dramatic. I think, any new piece of information that hits the news, they are just screaming impeachment. Not all of them, some of them. And that's worn way old. That's gotten way old. And but there are some on our side that deny everything is real, and that gets way old too.
What are, just as a thoughtful person, regardless of where it would lead, what are questions that you have? You and I we're basically spectators here. We're reading these stories as they appear in the New York Times, the Washington Post. What are some specific questions that you would ask if you were on that committee? Well,
I think bottom line up front, what I'd want to know is, who was talking to the Russians, if in fact that was happening? Why? What were the discussions? Because I think it's possible that there were some in his circle that were talking to them that he didn't know about. Again, I don't think this rises up to him, frankly, from what I've seen. I'd want to know that. I'd want to know, what happened after. A lot of different questions about that. But I think when it's all said and done, I'm putting a lot of faith in Robert Mueller, who I think is a great American, to really just do the right thing and get people the answers they need.
Mm-hmm. Are there any, as you've thought about it in your head, are there any lines that if they were crossed would really change your thinking about this for you? For example, the president has already publicly said in the NBC News interview with Lester Holt that he fired Director Comey with the Russia probe and its escalation in mind. Does that trouble you? What are your own red lines?
It's concerning. I don't want to put what my red lines are because, again, as a not legal expert, I don't know what rises to illegal or improper or not. And so I think in those hypotheticals, it's kind of dangerous to put my red lines out there. I want to see what the answers are here, and then we can make a decision. I hope there's nothing to any of this, and I hope that the president has a very successful 4 or 8 years.
Well, you mentioned the Democrats, sort of shouting impeachment at every new, sort of newspaper article. What does that feel like up here on Capitol Hill? Is it something that people are actually talking about sort of in a process way, like nuts and bolts way?
Not really. Actually, to be honest with you, no. I don't know within Democratic circles if they are. But on our side, no. I mean, we don't think that that's going to happen. But the Democrats are the ones that are talking about it, and so I'm sure they're having their conversations about that. But no, it's not something we're talking about. We're trying to focus on our agenda out here, and we've had some difficulty getting some of that over the finish line, and so that's where we're really doubling down.
That's a very diplomatic way of putting it. Where you mentioned incivility and how this was one of the issues that you've tried to pick up on. You're wearing right now a sticker, in honor of your colleague, Congressman Scalise, after the recent shooting. You just put out on Twitter the other day, an example of some of the incredibly I don't even know how to characterize
evil.
it.
I say evil.
Evil public discourse aimed at you and other Republicans after this shooting, and the idea that people would respond to this by, basically saying he deserved it, things like that. Have you seen market deterioration in discourse over the last year as a result of this 2016 election? Yeah,
I think both. I mean, look, both sides are responsible. And I think if somebody says only the other side's responsible, they're responsible for this. They're part of the problem. Both sides had it. President Obama had a lot of threats against him. We know about that. I've never seen it this bad, though, personally. And, when somebody puts a tweet saying, I wish you were on second base during the shooting, or I wish the plane had hit the Capitol instead of being taken out by the hero passengers because it would be better off for our country, or Lincoln deserved to be assassinated. Those kinds of things are what they're saying. I thought it was important to put that out there because, as a Christian, frankly, I believe that the best way to expose darkness is to bring it to light. And so people can see the kind of thoughts. And I don't do it to say, woe is me. Like, I got thick skin, I can handle it. But I think people need to see the kind of discourse out there. And frankly, it's got to change. And we can have arguments and debates, and we should have passionate debates. And sometimes they should get too heated. But when it breaks up Thanksgiving dinner, and when mom and dad are in the basement watching news and getting angry and having heart attacks, that's when it's gone too far.
And what about the sort of use of the presidential bully pulpit to name call and things like that? Does that have an effect?
Yeah, it does. It does. It's all the way from a guy that's on the city council to the president of the United States. We all have a responsibility to bring the tone back to civility. That includes the president. And I hope we're seeing more of that.
Well, I can see that you have, a very busy schedule up here today, but I want to just circle back, at the very end to the questions that originally prompted this conversation, which are really about your own very unusual experience as a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan in a Congress where mostly that's not the case.
Right.
You have some thoughts about how to re-engage the United States really in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, after you've been very critical of President Obama's policy in those places. What is your view about what is possible right now? Is there a more winning scenario for how the U.S. could engage?
I think we have to understand that we are in a generational fight. I think the mistake that was made at the beginning of the war on terror was this belief that if we just liberated Afghanistan or did whatever, it would be over. We're not fighting a state in ISIS. We're fighting an ideology, and ideologies are only defeated from within. I look at this as like the Cold War, just with more shooting. It took us 50 years and basically second and third generation to overthrow the cloak of communism from within. That's what it's going to take in this. And where I think we're short-sighted, which is my concern, we'll defeat the Islamic State, but there'll be ISIS 2 and Al-Qaeda 3 and ISIS 5 that comes along. We've got to fight the next generational war on terror against and with the 7 and 8-year-olds. Now, I say that to sound controversial. What I mean is those 7 and 8-year-olds right now that are internally displaced from the evil of Assad, they're the ones that, if they're given no hope and no opportunity, are going to be easy recruits for the next generation of ISIS. If they're given hope and opportunity and the ability to read an optimistic view of the world, they're way less recruitable. That's why you don't see huge recruitings in the United States, because people have opportunity. And so I think we have to focus on that next generational fight to be successful.
So, Congressman, we'll end with this, but, we started with our conversation a year ago and your views about Donald Trump and foreign policy at a time when neither you nor I probably thought he was going to become the president.
Or him. He didn't think so.
Or him, exactly. So, as you look ahead over the next year, what do you think we're going to be talking about a year from now?
It's really hard to tell. I think we'll have answers to this investigation, and so we'll talk about that, whatever that looks like. I think on a foreign policy front, I think stuff in Syria will come to a head, and I don't know if that means escalation or if that means de-escalation, but I think we're going to have some kind of a very different situation there. I think ISIS will probably be destroyed, but that's actually going to be the beginning of our difficulties. And so, it'll be interesting a year from now. Stuff has changed so fast in the last year that I've learned it's really hard to predict, but I do believe that we are in a world that, while capitalism has brought people way more opportunity and way more hope, there are a lot of low-grade battles everywhere. And as Americans, we have to remember that our job is to be an example of self-governance to billions that are desperate for a taste of what we have.
You talked about picking your battles. You have picked a few with the president, a notoriously thin-skinned president. Have there been any retaliation for you?
No, not at all. Not at all. In fact, the couple times I've met with him, He's been very complimentary, and so I'll continue to do what I think is the right thing for my country and my district. And if that means call out the president or support him, I want to support him whenever I can, and I'll oppose them when I have to.
Thank you so much. That's Congressman Adam Kinzinger. I'm delighted to have him as the guest on this week's Global Politico. And of course, you can always tune into us on iTunes or whatever is your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe to us and email me anytime at sglasser@politico.com. Thanks
you.
again.
You bet.